It's 11 o'clock. I think we can start. We are just in time. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the E&I Enrico Mattei Foundation lecture on the rise of tight oil, a global energy revolution. First of all, let me thank our distinguished speakers, Bahattin B.Buyuksahin and Bassam Fattouh, who accepted to help us address a very complicated but interesting issue and foster a lively debate. Secondly, let me explain why E&I Enrico Mattei Foundation, a research institution which traditionally has focused its attention on development and sustainability, decided to address such a technical topic as the one of the tight oil. As many of you already know, over the years, the foundation, the E&I Enrico Mattei Foundation, has developed research strengths in the field of environmental economics, gaining a strong international reputation as a leading research center on climate change and sustainable development. Today, these topics are investigated by the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Research Program, which constitutes the pillar of FEAM activities. FEAM stands for E&I Enrico Mattei Foundation in Italian. Following a debate started past year within the board of directors of FEAM, our research plan has been updated with the intention of adding the study of the social and the human dimension of development to the more technical and academic research. It was decided to give greater emphasis to the economy and society research program in order to widen the range of topics, including the great ongoing geopolitical and economic shifts. In our opinion, the revolution generated by the extraction of non-conventional oil represents one of these major shifts and could mark a turning point in internationally consolidated political and economic scenarios. Important geopolitical and economic transformations are likely to happen in the near future and must be addressed. In order to tackle these challenging and timely topics, E&I Enrico Mattei Foundation decided to organize a cycle of 3 meetings focused on the global impact of the tight oil revolution within its Economy and Society Research Program. This is the first meeting, focused on the quantitative dimension of tight oil revolution and its impact on the production framework worldwide. In this meeting, our speakers will tackle the topic from the point of view of energy markets. They will give us a preliminary overview of the development prospects of tight oil, their impact on the international import-export flows of oil, and their impact on oil price and global production. In the second meeting, next year, in 2014, we will invite an expert in geopolitics to discuss the impact of tight oil supply on USA strategies, and in particular how the USA strategies of presence and intervention in some hot areas of the planet would change. In the third meeting, always in 2014, I would like to invite a Chinese expert in energy and geopolitics to discuss how the tight oil revolution may change China's presence and political influence in the main international oil production areas in view of a hypothetical backward progress of the United States. Turning back to today's meeting, Bahattin, B.Buyuksahin and Bassam Fattouh, internationally acclaimed experts on the topic, will present the results of their recent studies on tight oil, focusing on its implications in terms of pricing, crude oil and petroleum products trade flows, and its impact on key producers. Bahattin B.Buyuksahin is the first speaker. He will give a lecture on North American oil boom, outlook and challenges. Bahattin currently heads the research on commodity markets as the researcher advisor of commodities at the Bank of Canada. Prior to joining the Bank of Canada, he was a senior oil market analyst at the International Energy Agency and a senior econometrician at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, in Washington. He has a distinguished and renowned experience in financial oil and energy markets. Bassam Fattouh is the second speaker. He will give a lecture on tight oil revolution in global perspective and potential implications on Middle East producers. Bassam is the director of the Oil and the Middle East program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. He is also a research fellow at St. Anthony's College and professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He has published a variety of articles on the international oil pricing system and dynamics, OPEC pricing power, security of Middle Eastern oil supplies. This half-day is organized as follows. We will have the two lectures, and at the end of the two lectures, there will be a cross-discussion between the speakers. The meeting will close with a Q&A session with the public. Now, moving to the end of my welcome speech, let me thank all the FIM staff who have been working to prepare this event and is going to organize the next two lectures. Wishing you a fruitful conference and a pleasant stay at the ENI Enrico Mattei Foundation, I give the floor to Bahattin B.Buyuksahin for the first lecture. Bahattin, thank you. I'm sorry, Bahattin. I have my sheets showing you the time remaining before the expected end of your lecture. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and the end.
Okay, thanks. First, let me thank for inviting us here. It's always a great pleasure to come here. So today, I'll be talking about North American oil boom, outlook, and challenges. North America basically is undergoing a renaissance in crude oil production not seen in decades, driven by rapid developments in unconventional crude oil resources such as tight oil and oil sands. Tight oil in the United States, oil sands in Canada. Tight oil is still in the very early stage in Canada, so we cannot talk about tight oil revolution in Canada, but oil sands is becoming major energy sources for Western Canada. Over the last 5 years, combined crude oil production from Canada and the US has risen by nearly 3 million barrels per day to 13 million barrels per day in 2012. Unconventional crude oil production is rising rapidly, but these resources are far more costly than conventional production. Basically, this production or unconventional oil production has been made possible only by elevated crude oil prices over the last decade. Sometimes we always complain, okay, we have the very high oil prices, but these high oil prices actually have some benefits in terms of what's called giving us the opportunity to explore or extract these tight oil resources. Of course, given their higher supply cost, a sufficiently elevated market price for crude oil is one of the necessary conditions for Canadian oil sands or tight oil to continue to displace or increase in terms of production. If, for example, crude oil prices decline to the extent that suggested by the futures curve in coming years, we might see actually some investment delays and shut-in at the marginal oil sands project. So let me start now giving some stylized facts about global oil markets and its implication for North America, North American oil production. And Bassam will talk a lot on the global implication, but I'm going to talk a lot on the what's called North American implication. In this picture of global demand addition or global demand growth, we can see that OECD demand in blue has been in decline since 2006 due to improvements in fuel efficiency, demographic trends, and especially in the US, fuel switching towards lower cost natural gas. New addition of demand are all coming from emerging markets such as China, and are related growth in personal transportation associated with rising income and urbanization. Here, this is the latest IEA projection. Basically, OECD demand is declining, or on the other hand, basically, East Asian or Asian demand is increasing. Basically, production is moving towards west, consumption is moving towards east. This has a dynamic of changing the trade direction in terms of mainly US and Europe becoming less and less dependent on the foreign oils. I mean, especially, of course, US, because their production is increasing, consumption declining. On the other hand, European consumptions are declining. We don't see any increase in production. And the one other important fact is Middle East becoming a major oil demand center, especially Saudi Arabia using oil in terms of power and all this stuff. So we will see Middle East demand to increase further. Global supply, on the other hand, global supply has increased by about 5 million barrels per day since 2007 to reach 94.6 million, owing partly to increase in North American production. This IEA, for example, forecast that global supply capacity is set to increase further by 8.4 million barrels to 103 million in 2018, of which more than 40% will come from North American oil sands and light tight oil production. And here, basically, the share of conventional crude oil production in total crude oil production is steadily declining. By 2035, it is going to be close to 65% only. In 1980s, this share, it was about 92%. The biggest increase here is basically natural gas liquids and also light tight oil and extra heavy oil and bitumen, which is the Canadian oil sands. Actually, this came, this is the global oil consumption figure, but I want to talk about a little bit crude oil production. This was kind of a surprise to everybody, especially increase in tight oil production is completely catch people in surprise. For example, in 2007, EIA projection, EIA was projecting 10.1 million barrel per day production of crude oil in the US by 2020. They increased this production to 12.7 million barrel per day by 2020 in their latest forecast. Basically, I was talking with Adam Szymanski last month, and we should expect another forecast revision very soon. Exactly, and again, production might be increasing more than 500,000 barrels in addition to recent forecasts. Okay, let me talk a little bit about North American oil production, what has been happening and what we should see. After decades of decline, US production basically recovered sharply since 2008, largely as a result of elevated oil prices. Basically here, what is the question, of course, becomes, what is the impact of increase in US oil production globally and also domestically? Here we see basically the recent increase in US oil production is due primarily to the extraction of a new unconventional source of oil known as tight oil from the oil-bearing shale. Tight oil is more difficult to access than conventional oil, requiring oil companies to drill wells horizontally and break up the surrounding rock using a technique known as hydraulic fracturing. These techniques are also used to access gas from shale formation, more commonly known as shale gas. Of course, compared to conventional oil, this source of oil is much more costly to produce. The minimum cost to produce, basically, I'm not talking about capital expenditure, capex or something, in order to break even stuff, it's about $50. It goes to $50 to $80. On the other hand, if you look at Canadian side, Canadian oil production is primarily due to increase in oil sands, which is shown here with blue. Basically, conventional heavy oil, as you see, it is declining, and tight oil slowly increasing, but it is not a major source of energy or oil in Canadian oil production. But the oil sands is becoming a major player in the energy sector. And of course, Eastern Canada oil production, which is conventional, of course, it is declining, and Eastern Canada needs more because most of Canadian refineries are in the eastern sides, basically Montreal and Ontario, and they are going to need more oil from either the United States or other countries. Here, basically, there are currently two main types of main methods for oil sands production. First one is open pit surface mining, and in situ recovery. When oil sands deposits are close to the surface, they can be recovered using surface mining technique. Once recovered, oil sands are mixed with hot fodder, which creates slurry that is then transported to upgraders where the bitumen will be separated out. Of course, the second technique is basically in situ. It is much more deeper, and you need to either horizontally drill and then heat it, what's called rock or sands, get the bitumen over there. Here's, as you see in this picture, U.S. tight oil production has been increasing since 2008, and we expect Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers or EIA or the IEA expect this production increase or growth will come to the end around 2020 and then slowly decline further. However, oil sands production is expected to grow further to reach 5 million barrel per day by 2030. And basically, as you see here also, U.S. Oil production and Canadian oil production, some argue that U.S., for example, IEA argues that U.S. oil production will be the highest by 2015, exceeding the Saudi Arabia as the global leader in oil production. But the reason, basically, U.S. we generally talk about U.S. oil or energy independence. It's not the only oil production, but the decline in consumption. Overall, basically, North America, in our opinion, should move closer towards crude oil or energy independence as domestic production increases while consumption declines due to efficiency gains. Here, one picture. It is very striking, actually, for me. With rising production and declining consumption, the U.S. dependence on foreign oil continues to decline. In 2012, for example, the U.S. domestic production met just 50% of domestic demand. Based on the IEA medium-term oil report, it is expected that domestic demand could account for 65% of consumption by 2018. Here, we have to remember decline in crude oil imports reflects several reasons. Basically, one is high oil prices in 2007, 2008, and the second one is the financial crisis, and the third one, of course, since 2010, growth in production in U.S. light oil basically curbed the imports of foreign crude oil into the United States. Since 2005, imports of lighter, but there's an important difference here. It's not all oil, but it is the lighter and medium grade oil imports declined, not the heavy crude oil. Heavy crude oil still what's called relatively constant, but the source of the import has changed. For example, the U.S. is no longer imports a lot of oil from Venezuela or Mexico, but from Canada. The source is changing, but the amount of heavy crude oil, imported heavy crude oil, did not change a lot. But the light and medium crude oil have been on decline. Light crude oil imports declined more than 1.28 million barrels to 1 million now. Medium crude oil imports have declined 4.28 million to 2.9, and heavy crude imports close to, relatively stable at 3.5 million barrels per day. As you see here, since 2005, imports of lighter and medium grades have been on the decline. especially oil from Nigeria, which are the source of light crude oil, and Angola and Algeria have declined, and the reason is basically the increase in oil production from Bakken, and now Eagle Ford is providing a lot of light crude oil, which U.S. do not need anymore. On the other hand, if you look at the U.S. heavy crude oil imports, most of heavy crude imports have been declining, except basically Canada. And also, you might see here Saudi Arabia, imports from Saudi Arabia increased, but the reason is that Saudi Arabia opened, actually expanded one refinery in eastern coast of U.S. That's why we see increase in imports from Saudi Arabia. Otherwise, Saudi Arabian exports to U.S. was on decline also. Despite the declining total U.S. oil imports, as you see here, Canadian exports to the U.S. have been increasing steadily since 1990s. The share of imports from Canada has doubled between 1995 and 2012 to reach 28%. The increase in share has come at the expense of imports from OPEC and non-OPEC countries. The reason why is basically increase in Canadian oil imports because Canadian Western select is much, much cheaper than other oil. Of course, as you see here, trade direction as a result of increase in tight oil production or U.S. oil sands, trade direction has been changing. Basically, as I said, consumption moving to Asia, production moving to West. That's why we are seeing some change in trade direction, basically OSD America becoming less and less dependent on foreign oil, while the Asia, especially China, and also we are going to see India becoming much more dependent on foreign crude oil imports. Okay. What is the determinants of the scale and speed of North American oil boom? One fact is basically, as I said, it is the price, elevated price level. Unconventional resources extraction has been made possible only by record high prices. Oil prices rose rapidly in recent years, especially around 2008, that peaked in July of 2008, I believe. Brent crude was $145 and WTI $147, and then collapsed suddenly due to immediately after the Lehman demise, and slowly recovered. It did not reach the record level, but still it's at an elevated level. Dramatic and unexpected increase in North American crude oil production has in the meantime, dramatic and unexpected increase in North American crude oil production has overwhelmed the existing transportation infrastructure. As a result of inland supply bottlenecks, a wedge has been opened between North American global oil prices, as you see here in this period. WTI and Brent prices, spread between WTI and Brent prices almost reached $28 in 2011. Lately, in June or something, June 3rd or June 4th, WTI trading $1 above Brent, but now again, spread between the WTI and Brent increased, and then now WTI is at a discount of $20 or something. The reason basically, again, increase in production from Eagle Ford is going towards Gulf Coast. Now, we are not only talking about the bottlenecks in Cushing. Now we are talking about bottlenecks in Gulf area. It's a lot of light tight crude oil, but most of the refineries in Gulf Coast using heavy crude oil. Sometimes they are mixing light with the heavy, but it's not the solution anymore. So we are seeing increase in inventories in Gulf Coast, which I'm going to show you in a few slides. Okay. Another reason why we see increase in tight oil production in the U.S. is basically unique U.S. advantages. Basically, one fact is long history of government-sponsored research on shale gas exploitation, and unique legal and market structure, and plenty of mature infrastructure in place. Basically, if we ask the question, why has the U.S. has been able to increase production dramatically? In addition to its large endowment of shale resources, the U.S. has first benefited from government-subsidized research in shale extraction. Institutional features have also played a role, with well-defined property rights and financial incentive for landowners to giving up their mineral rights, helping to support exploration. For example, even in Canada, we do not have well-defined property rights because mineral rights or whatever underneath on the land, it belongs to the government. It doesn't belong to the individual property owners, while in the U.S., it's all property owners have the right to give the license and everything. So finally, United States, as both a producer and heavy user of petroleum, possesses large amounts of mature oil infrastructure, including the pipeline and all this stuff. And despite these enabling factors, we have to be cautious extrapolating recent production trends into the future. First, oil-rich shale formations are uncommon compared to their natural gas counterparts and often contain a lot of natural gas liquids, which are not substitutes for crude oil. Also, initial production rates often overstates the reservoir long-term production potential, as the most easily accessible oil is produced first. What are the constraints in that case, basically, on the U.S. oil production or the Canadian oil production? First is the cost curve. Basically, the long-run cost curve, as estimated by IEA, gives $10 to $70 barrel for conventional crude. However, the cost for unconventional are much higher, $50 to $90 a barrel for oil sands, $50 to $100 for light crude oil, and $50 to $90 for ultra deep water. Moreover, natural gas liquids have a lower energy density. Given the rising costs, and unconventional resource extraction has been made possible only by record high prices. However, as these resources have increased their share of supply, the level of industry capital expenditure have risen disproportionately. Indeed, this investment increased more than threefold in real terms over the past 12 years, doubled from $350 billion in 2005 to nearly $700 billion in 2012. Such capital investments are viable only if prices remain dramatically high. Otherwise, there is no way to increase capital expenditure in these fields. And I mean, we can see why, especially this revolution, if we are going to call revolution, title revolution in the U.S., cannot be extended to other countries which are capital constrained also. Not only, for example, Russia or other countries do not have well-defined property rights, but also they might not have the capital expenditure and the technological knowledge to bring these reserves to the earth. Okay. Another, another constraint might be basically the increase in production, to which basically you have to add the greater volumes in Western Canada, have caused a glut in inventories, not only the light crude oil, but also oil sands. So, thank you. Basically because of infrastructure and legal constraints that I will discuss in a moment. This glut in inventories has depressed U.S. oil prices, leading to divergence between U.S. and global oil prices. Here, one example, for example, this plot draws price of WTI, Brent. Brent is black, and then WTI is blue, and WCS is the red one. Basically, we see at some point, as 15 days ago or something, the spread between WTI and WCS is about $50, $42, $43. And if you add Brent prices, spread, it's about $60 or something. And Canada, for example, is exporting WCS and importing Brent at the Brent prices, which is affecting, of course, terms of trade and also trade balances. We have to be very cautious on that. Basically, the combination of infrastructure and legal constraint is responsible for the differential between North American and global oil prices. Basically, we have here in black, we have the price of Brent as a proxy for global oil prices. In blue, we have a price of WTI, and we have the Western Canada crude. Although the oil industry has succeeded in overcoming these constraints by relying on alternative forms of transportation, such as rail, basically, rail transportation increased a lot from Bassam to Eastern Coast. Now they are transporting more than 500 kbd a day, but still rail transport is much costlier than pipeline, and also it has much more what you call environmentally important implication as this. Sorry. Yeah. Basically, Bahattin to it's about 1,000 miles. It's 1,000 miles. But the thing is, rail transportation is much more developed in the U.S. You can, it has a flexibility to carry wherever you want. On the other hand, with the pipeline, you have to, I mean, it's a fixed stuff, but still there are lots of disadvantages of what's called rail transportation, which is about, for example, from Bahattin to Gulf Coast pipeline, it's about $5 to $6, and rail, it's about $12 per barrel. Okay. Let us, of course, there are logistical constraints, basically dramatic and unexpected increase in North American crude oil production. As you said, they created glut in the inventories, and also basically, for example, between 2010 and 2012, pipeline capacity for delivering crude oil into Cushing increased by more than 800,000 barrels per day, including 590 kbd Trans-Canada Keystone pipeline, which carries crude oil from Alberta. But if you tell me one of the obstacles why Canada cannot produce more is because of insufficient transportation capacity. For example, if U.S. do not accept the Keystone XL pipeline, so we do not expect increase in Canadian oil sands production, because the rejection of Keystone XL pipeline might lead to rejection of other projects, pipeline project from Alberta to Vancouver and all this stuff. Therefore, it is important, very important to get the acceptance in the what's called US. As I said, there is glad, basically inventories increased in both Cushing and also Gulf Coast, especially if you look at here with the rise of Eagle Ford production, Gulf Coast crude oil inventory increase, and also now we see not only wedge between WTI and Brent. Now there is a wedge between Louisiana light sweets, which is the waterborne, and Brent spread open. Basically now it is $16 almost. So we see this spread between this oil to continue unless the export restriction, for example, in the U.S. U.S. can export crude products but cannot export crude itself. So as long as, except to NAFTA members, but they are now only exporting 400 KBD to Canada in terms of crude. Unless the what's called U.S. Made dramatic changes in its export licensing or something, we do not see what's called closing of the spread between WTI and Brent, or LLS and Brent. All right. As I said, I'm not going to go over, basically, we have the pipeline, new pipeline projects are underway, but still a long way to overcome the what's called pipeline capacity problem, especially for the Canadian Alberta oil sands. So we now see as if production reach its limit. All right. Okay. And also, we said there are legal constraints, including restriction, have also helped segment the North American market and have contributed to widening of the Brent WTI discount. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, which restrict the exports of U.S. crude oil, and the U.S. Merchant Marine Act, which increased the cost of shipping U.S. crude by sea to domestic destination, have restricted demand for U.S. light sweet crudes to refineries in the Gulf Coast region. Since these refineries are optimized to process medium and heavy crude oil, they have a lower willingness to pay for the light oils, which depress the price of these crude oils. What is the, in terms of, basically, after all this, what's the implication for global crude markets? When stepping back and looking at the global oil market context, the remarkable increase in U.S. oil production loses some of its impact. Global oil production is currently around 90 million barrels per day, and the United States has displaced nearly 3 million barrels per day of foreign crude oil imports between 2006 and 2013. However, this must be measured against an 11 million barrel per day increase in non-OECD crude oil demands over the same period. Projection of North American supply growth must also be put into perspective. Our structural model, for example, suggests that the most optimistic supply scenario for the US and Canada implies 8% decline in global oil prices. This assumes no change in OPEC production, no reaction function from Saudi Arabia and all this stuff, and only 8%. Basically, let me bring this one here. As you see here, basically this decline, we assume that 30% increase US crude production over 3 years, permanent increase, and this bring about 8% at the maximum decline in global oil prices. And later on, of course, as the demand increases, then we will see this impact, which will be much, much lower. The last question I want to answer, basically, can the US experience be replicated? Basically, although the shale resources are plentiful across the globe, we are pessimistic that the US experience will be replicated in other countries and create global oil glut in the process. This is due to the fact that shale discoveries outside the North America do not share the US enabling circumstances. For example, in China, where the government has made shale extraction a priority, production prospects are adversely affected by a lack of infrastructure and human capital. The IEA, for example, predicts that tight oil production in China will take a decade to rise 200 KBD per day by 2030. The US has been able to grow its tight oil production by 10 times that amount in half the time. As a result, global supply growth will come from high-cost unconventional sources such as offshore discoveries and unstable regions like such as Iraq. At the same time, the rate at which production declines in mature oil fields is expected to accelerate, making it more difficult to generate net addition to global supply. In the face of relentless growth in emerging markets demand and production headwinds, the need to sustain global oil supply growth implies that prices will need to stay elevated in the long run. As you see, this is the basically recent IEA documents. Still, US is the biggest what's called increase in terms of tight oil, and Canada oil sands, it is the dark blue, and we might see some Russian light crude oil, but not before 2025 or something, and the rest of the world is basically almost nothing. And I'll just skip this part since Giuseppe already said he's going to bring my end. To conclude, the recent increase in oil prices has been kind of a mixed blessing. Although they have been source of discontent for consumers, high oil prices have made the extraction of tight oil resources profitable. Some analysts view the recent boom in US production as a window into the future of global oil market with a surge in supply and fall in prices. However, we argue that critical factors supporting this surge, including human capital, beneficial institution, and infrastructure in place, may not exist outside the US. As a result, global supply boom is unlikely, and the prices are expected to remain high in the long run. Thank you so much for this great opportunity.
Thank you, Bahattin.
Sorry.
Now I give the floor to Bassam Fattouh for his presentation.
It gives me great pleasure to be here today. I would like to thank FEAM for their kind invitation. And it's always really a challenge to talk after Bahattin, after such a comprehensive presentation. But I will try to give you a slightly different perspective. Not that I disagree with anything that Bahattin said, but I'm just going to also look at some of the, just going to try to put the tight oil revolution in global perspective and try to examine some of the implications on the Middle East producers in particular. Now, just to give you a little bit of overview of what the US are thinking about their global revolution. And I'm going to use some of the quotes here just to describe what some people describe as hype, actually. You know, that's Robin West from PFC Energy. He describes what's happening in the US as the energy equivalent of the Berlin Wall coming down. Just as the trauma of the Cold War ended in Berlin, so the trauma of the 1973 oil embargo is ending now. Ed Morse from Citigroup describes what's happening in the US. The growing continental surplus of hydrocarbons point to North America effectively becoming the new Middle East by the next decade. I have no idea that the US was aspiring to become the Middle East, but any case, you know, that's what we're hearing from there. Ed Morse, again, and the Citigroup, also examines some of the wider implications as well of what's as a result of what's happening in the US. So he argues that some producer countries, those suffering most acutely from the resource scarce, may see their leadership come under heightened pressure for economic and political reform as revenues gradually diminish, raising the risk of creating new failed state in the process. So again, you know, the implications, at least from some of the views from the US, is that it's really not only about oil markets. The implications are much more beyond oil markets, even affecting the political stability in some of producing countries. Of course, the IEA could not but join this hype. And in a recent report, they described the supply shock created by a surge in North American oil production will be as transformative to the market over the next 5 years as was the rise of Chinese demand over the last 15 years. And just to give you an idea of what happened in Chinese demand, between 1997 and 2012, Chinese oil consumption increased from less than 4 million barrels per day to more than 10 million barrels per day. So that has actually been quite transformative on the demand side. So they're expecting something similar on the supply side. Finally, as well, and that's I think is worth mentioning as well, because I will come to it later in my presentation, and that's Phil Legger, an economist from the US, where he describes the low price of natural gas is going to drive oil from the market. Oil in the US is going to have a Kodak moment. Okay, so these are some of the messages, some of the implications, at least the way some of the people see some of the implications of what's going on, or some of the impacts of the tight oil revolution. So the question I'm going to try to ask today, is this really hype justified? Are we really going to see some of these effects on the oil market? Now, the one way to look at the tight oil revolution is it has been a positive supply shock. And I think very few people would disagree that the US has been really a positive supply shock. From a negative annual growth in 2008, US added around 1 million barrels per day in liquid production between 2009 and 2011. It added 1 million barrels per day. That's growth. In 2012, it's adding another 1 million barrels per day in 2013, and it's expected to add another 1 million barrels per day in 2014. So that's actually is quite dramatic. Even if you look at the history of the oil industry, it's very rare that we have seen that the country is able to increase 1 million barrels per day for such a consecutive period of time. And it's also very important to remember that part of the US tight oil revolution as well is natural gas liquids. The annual average growth between 2009 and 2012 has been 150,000 barrels per day, which is quite impressive. And this is thanks to the tight oil production growth, particularly to two plays, Bakken and Eagle Ford. And you can see actually the vertical line. You know, if you look at the Eagle Ford, you had very, very slow growth, and all of a sudden you have this vertical increase. And now they are producing close to 1 million barrels per day, which is quite impressive by all standards. Of course, because of this rapid increase in production, infrastructure was not able to keep pace with this increase in production, and we have seen the dislocation of US crudes. And if you look at the WTI Brent price differential, at one point it was $25. As the infrastructure started being sorted or ironed out, some of the infrastructure problems, we started seeing this differential narrowing down. But recently, those differentials also started to widen. What is quite interesting is to realize is, despite the fact that we have such impact of this dislocation of, despite the fact that we have this dislocated benchmark or pricing benchmark, the US consumer really did not benefit from these low crude oil prices. If you look at the gasoline prices, they have remained quite stable, and they're very close to what they were in 2010, which means that who benefit most from this dislocated crude? It was refineries. That's why in the US nowadays they call the golden age of refineries. Of course, in Europe that's a dream, but at least in the US it is a reality. Now, these supply improvements are accompanied with a decline in oil demand. Year-on-year change in total demand has turned negative in the US. Annual average decline is around 230,000 barrels per day between 2009 and 2012. And many people believe that gasoline demand has peaked in the US in 2007. So these two factors of supply improvement and decline in oil demand meant that the US is importing less crude oil. And one has to admit that this reduction in crude oil imports have been quite impressive, from above 10 million barrels per day just in 2005. At one point in 2013, the US was importing less than 8 million barrels per day. So this is really quite a dramatic improvement. At the same time, we have seen also the US becoming a very important exports of products, mainly gasoline and diesel. And you can see that sharp rise from 2010, from less than 1.5 million barrels per day to more than 3 million barrels per day. And diesel exports really have been quite impressive. So the US is not only reducing its imports of crude oil, but it's also increasing its export of products. Now, let's put this positive supply shock in the global perspective, because the US is only one moving part. And one interesting thing about the oil market is that there are many moving parts, with the US being, of course, one of the most important moving parts in recent years. However, in the last 3 years, what we have seen is that the US supply shock has consistently been offset by declines somewhere else. In 2011, we had a lot of problems in non-OPEC supply outside the US, which actually offset most of the increase which is coming in the US. In 2012, we had another offset as well. That was a result of problem within OPEC countries. In 2013, we also had a similar offset as well. So every time the US was adding supplies, what we have seen is that other parts of the world has been offsetting this increase. So that's why one has to be very careful of looking at the world of oil supply from the prism of the US only, because this tends to give the impression that there's a lot of oil in the market. But in the last few years, what we really have seen in practice is that the US has only helped offset the decline in non-OPEC countries and other parts of the world. And that's why, despite consistent prediction that we're going to see a decline in OPEC production, actually OPEC production have been quite healthy. And they have been persistently close to 30 million barrels per day, or even above 30 million barrels per day. And if you look on the year-on-year changes in Saudi Arabian supply in particular, you would see from that graph from the right that the year-on-year growth has been positive, and Saudi Arabia is currently producing at record levels close to 10 million barrels per day. Now, whenever we talk about revolution, that impact of the revolution should be felt automatically on prices. But what we have seen in the last 3 years is that the quarterly Brent prices have remained quite stable. And they have remained quite stable above $100 per barrel. And this, as I say, is quite remarkable, despite the fact during this period we have seen one of the biggest shocks in the oil market. We have seen sanctions on Iran, macroeconomic uncertainty. We have seen the US revolution. We have Libya disruption. We had seen the Arab Spring. And despite of all of these shocks, what we have seen, oil prices remain stable. And I always tell my students, whenever market seems extremely stable, it means that there's some sort of regulation taking place. And I'll come back to this point later on. But also, if you look at the long-term price, what the market is expecting 7 years ahead, what you will see as well that the price really has not moved much. It's still expecting, the market's still expecting a price of $90 to $95 in the long term. So perhaps the question could be posed differently. How high would oil prices have been if it wasn't for the US oil revolution? Unfortunately, for economists, these counterfactual scenarios are very difficult to assess. But perhaps one way to look at the impact of the US tight oil revolution is is putting a cap on the oil price rather than moving prices down. Nowadays, there is this belief of the gathering of the perfect storm. And why is this important? Because there's a realization in the market that developments in the US alone cannot move the market to a low equilibrium price. In addition to the US, you need other factors. And that's why one has to be very careful in the analysis which is presented, because usually the US is presented with other factors in order to create a low price scenario. And some of these are global oil demand to slow down considerably, non-OPEC supply outside the US reverses its downward trend and improves its performance. So we're going to see Brazil, former Soviet Union, all of this coming back at a big scale. Outages in the oil market will ease. So we're going to see the return of the Iranian barrels. We're going to see more of Libyan production. And OPEC members, especially Iraq, will increase its production capacity. And this, in turn, will affect the cohesion within OPEC folds. And this will affect the cohesion within OPEC. So that's why there is this idea that all of these factors are likely to happen together. Some people tend to think of the oil market in terms of binary outcomes. Either none of these factors happen or all of these factors happen at the same time. But let's assume that all of this perfect storm gathers. Under these conditions, the question becomes, will the US oil shale continue to grow at the current pace? And that's why I have always argued that the squeeze on OPEC, the source of the squeeze matters. There are many sources of squeeze on OPEC production. So this can come from reduction in demand. It can come in increase from US production. It can come from increase in non-OPEC production outside the US. But it also would come from production within OPEC itself. And what I would say is that the source of the squeeze also matters, because one needs to make a distinction between a high-cost versus a low-cost producer. The US is a very high-cost producer, but at the same time, this introduces elasticity to the supply curve. So if oil prices go up a lot, we're going to see a good supply response coming from the US. If oil prices go down, we're going to see a slowdown in the US growth. And that actually is one of the most interesting features of the US supply, is that it has introduced some elasticity to the supply curve, elasticity that we have lost for a long period of time. Now, the squeeze from a low-cost producer is fundamentally different, let's say from Iraq, because it's much less responsive to price movement for the simple fact that producers such as Iraq are likely to continue to produce huge rents even in a low oil price environment. And that's why there's a distinction to be made whether the competition outside OPEC or competition inside OPEC, which one matters more. And in my point of view, is actually competition within OPEC which matters more, especially if Iraq enters at a large scale. How would this affect the cohesion within OPEC? And what we are seeing at the moment is very clear messages from Iraq. For instance, the Iraqi officials are saying more and more, many times, that Iraq will never cut production. Reuters have reported as well, the view from Riyadh said delegates at the meeting is that Iraq should contribute to the next round of OPEC supply curves. If Saudi pushed that line, there would be dark days ahead, warned a senior Iraqi official. Iraq wants to stay in OPEC, but if OPEC is not helping us, then we are looking at our interests. So this is the type of scenario which I think is unlikely at the moment, but this is the type of scenario that you need in order to push us to the low oil price environment. The US alone cannot do it. Now, one needs to also take into account the reaction function of other producers, and one could look a little bit in the history to see how would some of the key producers behave in response to some of the increases within OPEC. For instance, in 1986, when other OPEC members were increasing their production, actually Saudi Arabia in particular responded by increasing their production as well at the same time. This led to the flood of the oil market and to the collapse of the OPEC administered pricing system, and actually to the collapse of the oil price. Are we likely to see something similar in the coming few years? I doubt it very much, because the context have changed dramatically. Saudi Arabia's production is at record levels. It could afford to cut production to stabilize the price, and actually it can tolerate a low oil price environment as well. However, one has to take into account that Saudi Arabia is willing to cut production only below a certain level, because market share always matters. And I think this is the key uncertainty in the market at the moment. Will Saudi Arabia decide to keep oil in the ground and stabilize the price, or will it seek to maintain a market share? Is there this magical number below which it will say that I will not go below this number? And rather than arguing that Saudi Arabia does not matter to the oil market in the coming few years, I would say that the decisions that Saudi Arabia makes in the next few years actually still matter a lot, because its decision whether to seek market share or to protect price is quite important. They cannot do both. Now, this moves us to two scenarios. Are we talking really about oil scarcity or oil plenty? And what I would say is that at the moment there are disconnections in expectations, because there are two scenarios out there. There is the bearish scenario, which says that most of the demand in the next few years is likely to be met by non-OPEC unconventional oil growth, which means that OPEC will ultimately be left with huge spare capacity. Well, it's not that huge. It's around 6 million barrels per day by 2015, according to BP. And the only way in order to maintain the prices at current levels, it means that OPEC has to cut, and that's why BP argues that OPEC cohesion is a key to oil market uncertainty, especially in the current decade. However, it's very important to realize that there are some key risks to this bearish scenario. One of these key risks is that the range of forecasts of tight oil are very, very wide. So we really still don't know what's going to be the real potential of tight oil in the long-term horizon. The second thing is that the U.S. is only one moving part. There are many moving parts, and what we have seen recently, for instance, the Libyan oil production, many disruptions in the market. Now, if you really think that these disruptions are going to disappear, you have to really build a very optimistic case. And finally, and most importantly, I would say, what about investment? What about investment? If you are sending the signals that you're not going to rely on conventional oil and you're not going to rely on Middle East oil, etc., and all of this, it's natural under this environment for you to start cutting investment, or at least to wait. And that's actually one of the scenarios that could emerge, is that many of these producers will start cutting their investment plans. And actually, rather than ending up with a scenario where we have huge spare capacity, what we could see is toward the end of this decade, spare capacity being eroded slowly. And we know that whenever spare capacity becomes thin, then we're likely to see high oil prices, and oil prices are likely to be more volatile. So the point that I'm trying to make in this section is that the bearish scenario is one potential scenario, but it's not the only scenario in town. And it's very important to take also the dynamics and the reaction of other producers, because towards the 2020, we're likely to see a different oil market where spare capacity is quite low rather than being high. So this is one way to look at the US as an oil supply shock in the short term. But what about the long-term global impacts? Is it likely to have long-term impacts on the global market? And I think for that we need to ask three questions. First of all, can tight oil growth be replicated outside major plays in the US? Because so far what we have seen that most of the growth is coming from two plays. It's coming from the Eagle Ford and it's coming from Bakken. And even within each of these plays, what you will see is that the concentration is only in few counties. So few counties are doing extremely well within the shale plays, but others actually are not doing quite well. So that's the difference. The second question, can the US revolution be replicated globally? The issue is not about reserves, and that's something that Bahattin mentioned before, and I totally agree with his assessment, that it's very difficult to replicate what's happening in the US globally. Because what have been the main enablers of the shale revolution in the US? First of all, there was no shale revolution if it wasn't with a high oil price. And of course, you needed also technological advancement. But there are other factors as well which are specific to the US, which have also played a very important role. The favorable mineral rights with land ownership. It's a unique system only in the US. Dynamic exploration and production industry. Also very, very important, strong logistic and service providers, rig availability, deep financial markets, and very cheap credit. And I'm going to come to this later on. On top of that, you also needed liquid futures market because most of these producers actually are hedging their production forward, at least 2 years ahead. And of course, you need an extensive network of pipelines. You know, for instance, compare this with Russia. Government owns underground reserves. The corporate landscape is very, very different from what we're seeing in the US. The service sector is quite weak and low availability of rigs. Tax system is not conducive to this type of developments, and capital markets are extremely thin. Just to give you an idea of how expensive it is, these are some examples of some of the companies which in the US which are operating in the shale plays. And one thing which we have noticed is the rapid increase in their long-term debt. So most of these companies, in order to increase production, they rely heavily on long-term debt. And the figure on the right, what you will see is that the debt has been increasing and production has been increasing, but the debt has been increasing at a much higher rate. So the development strategy in the US have come at a great cost by drilling hundreds of expensive experimental wells and accumulating large amounts of debt. Existing model is quite expensive and cannot be simply replicated in other parts of the world. And that's why Schlumberger has come with an excellent, I think, assessment. And they say quite clearly, understanding the rock is the first and most critical key to effective shale development worldwide. Because if we don't understand the rock properly, it's going to be quite an expensive experiment which many countries in the world cannot replicate. The third question that we need to ask ourselves is, can gas substitute for oil in the transport at a large scale? Because this is part of the Kodak moment, is that the gas is able to replicate. Now, even by the most optimistic estimates which we have seen, it's unlikely for us to see a very large-scale substitution of gas in the transport sector. There might be a little bit in the truck industry, in the trucking industry, but not at a large scale. But also you need to remember that outside the US, gas prices are not cheap. And if you have seen the growth of natural gas vehicle across the world, it wasn't because gas prices were cheap, it was mainly due to government policy. Okay, because most parts of the world, the gas price is very much linked with oil indexed. However, I don't want you to give the impression that the only way to look at the US is only as a supply shock. And I think this is quite important to remember that the US, what's happening in the US is just beyond the supply shock. And I would like to just show a few slides of how what's happening in the US is affecting the changes in crude oil trade flows. This is the US crude imports from OPEC, the first graph. And you can see that they have declined dramatically from above 5 million barrels per day to less than 3 million barrels per day. Some of the countries have been affected more than others. For instance, in Algeria, its exports to the US have really declined sharply. Again, Nigerian crude oil export to the US have also collapsed because most of the Nigerian crude oil is light and the US is flooded with light crude oil. This actually means that a lot of the exporters have to find new markets for their crude oil. And that's why we are seeing some of the West African crudes going all the way to Asia. We're seeing Russian crude going all the way to also to Asia. So what we are likely to see is much more competition in the Asian markets of all of these producers trying to place their crude oil into Asia. And this is likely to affect some of the pricing mechanisms, and producers have to come with innovative techniques to with larger discount perhaps to place their crude oil in Asian markets. But it's also important to remember that what we are seeing in the US is not only in terms of crude oil, but also in terms of products, because gasoline exports have been rising, and we are also seeing diesel balances. The diesel balances have been quite dramatic. Exports of diesel have been rising fast. And if you're looking as well in the Gulf countries in particular, they're also increasing their refining capacity. And most of this increase in refining capacity is coming into the category of diesel, which means that those producers are likely to find it more and more difficult to place their diesel abroad. This is happening at a time where Asia is increasing its export of diesel, particularly China and India. This is happening at a time when Russians are upgrading their refineries to produce more diesel. And on top of that, the US are becoming important exporters of diesel at the same time. So all of this basically is happening at the same time, which is changing the product trade flows. So that's why I always make the point that it is much more beyond the US supply shock. It's also affecting a lot of the crude trade and product trade flows. So just to conclude, the US tight oil as a global and local supply shock. Locally, it has led to the dislocation of benchmark, which boosted refining margins. Globally, the impact has been camouflaged by poor performance in non-OPEC supply. The impact on global prices have not been felt yet. Of course, oil prices would have been much higher, perhaps without the US tight oil revolution. At the moment, there is this scenario, the perfect storm scenario, and the low oil price scenario. However, it's very important to realize that there is a little bit of disconnection in expectations, because uncertainty around the tight oil is still the name of the game. And the question that we need to ask ourselves, is the era of large spare capacity and cheap oil upon us? I would argue that this is only one of the many scenarios, and in my view, not perhaps the most probable scenario. One also has to take into account the strategic response from producers, and the source of competition matters. The US tight oil introduces more elasticity to the supply curve, so perhaps we're going to likely to see the oil price becoming trading within a narrow range or a wide range, because there's going to likely to be a cap or a floor on the oil price. However, in the long term, OPEC producers' incentive to invest one has to take into account. In an environment of uncertainty, the value of option to wait becomes extremely valuable. Could this result in a bullish scenario later on by the end of this decade? This is another probable scenario in one of the many scenarios that could emerge. And finally, the US tight oil growth is more than a supply shock. There's the risk or the opportunity of diffusion of technology globally. There's a shift in perception as a result of what's happening in the US from oil scarcity to oil abundance. There have been shifts in crude and oil product trade flows, affecting price differentials and affecting trade relations. And perhaps, and that's something you could perhaps discuss next year, whether there's going to be more flexibility in the US foreign policy, especially when dealing with Middle East producers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bassam. 30 minutes, perfect. And now the cross discussion. If you agree, I would start from Bassam discussing the presentation of Bahattin. And then you will discuss the presentation of Bassam.
Okay. Just on Bahattin's presentation, I have to say that I really enjoyed it. I had the opportunity to see the slide before. I think it provides a very comprehensive view of the US tight oil and Canadian oil sands and the potential implications on both the US, Canadian markets and the global oil markets. And really, I don't have a lot of points to make, just few observations, which hopefully we could pick up in the open discussion later on. And actually, you will see, Bahattin, that these are sort of questions rather than observation. The first one, in one of the charts that you put, we can see Canadian oil production increasing sharply to almost 7 million barrels per day in 2030. Now, my question, if infrastructure constraints persist and Canadian crude continue to be heavily disconnected to global benchmark, because as you mentioned, West Canadian crudes are trading at $40 discount to WTI and $60 discount to Brent. How will this affect current projections, current growth projections? For instance, could we see a sharp slowdown in Canadian production growth? Is this a real risk? The second observation is that we have seen Canadian exports to the US increasing steadily since the 1990s. But could this change looking ahead? There is a lot of talk about new infrastructure projects which could move Canadian production to Asian markets. How feasible are these projects? What are the constraints? What would such shifts, if they happen, what would be the implications on global trade flows, on pricing benchmarks, etc.? Some discussion of this actually would have been extremely useful. The last observation that I'd like to make is the potential impact of the US supply shock on global oil prices. Because in your presentation you mentioned the shock to the real crude oil price in response to 30% increase in US production could approximately put prices down about 8%. So are you assuming that the shock is not permanent? That's first of all. The second observation, would the results change dramatically if the US removes restrictions on crude exports? The third, should this exercise be done for light and heavy crudes separately? Because we can really no longer talk about crude oil market. The dynamics of the heavy crude and the light crude are quite different. Finally, should the exercise be repeated for price differentials? Because many analysts believe that the main impact is likely to be felt by price differentials rather than the price level. And I think perhaps it will also be a good opportunity as well to see whether it's possible to repeat this exercise in terms of the shifts in trade flows and some of the implications on price differentials. So, Bahattin, thank you again for an excellent presentation and for making us aware of all the various difficulties in assessing the impact of the U.S.-American revolution. But I like this idea that the U.S. will not have a big impact on global prices, but I think we are likely to be challenged more and more with this type of conclusion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bassam. It's always a pleasure to get feedback from you, as you know. For your first question, of course, if transportation bottleneck, what you call, continues, yes, we should expect sharp response from what you call Canadian producers, maybe in terms of investment delays or shut-ins. Basically, all the what you call supply projection depends on the assumption that what you call Keystone XL project will be approved, and of course new transportation or pipeline from Alberta to what you call British Columbia will be what you call built also. So if this what you call pipeline project will not be completed by 2016, that is the for the Keystone XL project, then of course we should see some what you call decline in Canadian oil sands production projection. Second, it is very related to the first. You are talking about the Asian demand and, of course, the U.S. demand. Basically, first we have to understand, still we don't have pipeline capacity from Alberta to British Columbia, which we cannot export to Asia. And that pipeline really depends on the approval of Keystone XL. British Columbia, for the time being, is saying, okay, if U.S. is not approving any pipeline, then why do we have to approve pipeline from Alberta to what you call British Columbia due to environmental concern, and of course they are going to wait for the decision by the President of United States. Unless we see approval from US on the Keystone XL, we are not going to see pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia, which will allow what you call export of Canadian oil sands to China and all the other Asian countries. In the meantime, we have seen export kind of export or whatever export from the Alberta region to what you call eastern provinces. That increased through railways. We don't have still pipeline, but the railways capacity has increased. But as you say, if we see some what you call export to Asian countries, that will be what you call that will have some impact on the Canadian oil prices in terms of because now the current stuff basically Canada depends on US markets. That's the only export destination, which creates a lot of fluctuation because it depends on the inventories in Cushing, inventories in Gulf, and of course the fluctuation is a lot in Canadian Western Select. Basically, in one day we saw prices jump to $10 or something. Next day fell to $6 and another $6. And third question is about our experiment with the 30% increase. Of course, it's not a permanent. It is at some point it's an increase in 3 years increase, but later on it's going to decline. And of course, you might be right. We might do some analysis on the what you call spread rather than the price itself. This is price on WTI, basically kind of light oil, increase in light production on light oil rather than Brent price or something. I totally agree with you. Some implication in terms of shift in trade flows and all this stuff, but we haven't done any analysis on that one. This is just a very basic experiment that U.S. production increases 30% over 3 years, then declines again, but that will reduce price of oil, WTI, by 8% in 4 years. Later on, it will increase again.
It's your turn, if you want, to comment Bassam presentation.
Since I put some of my comment in my BlackBerry, so I'll check it over there. Sorry. All right. First, I really enjoy Bassam presentation, and I have very few comments. Actually, it's not also comments, but just observation. Maybe I totally agree with his assessment of what you call investments. Basically, investment by OPEC countries. We should be really, really careful what signal we are sending to the market. Basically, if unconventional oil production increase and then OPEC countries takes this seriously and then they do delay investment, we might see some supply disruption not later than 2020 or something. That's I totally agree. And the second stuff is about the switching from oil to gas, and this is really, really problematic. Citibank expects that 30% of trucking fleet will be converted from oil to gas, natural gas, but in best scenarios, again, That's not possible. It is, up until now, it is only 5%, and according to Adam Sminsky, who is the head of the Energy Administration, Information Administration, basically, he's suggesting that it's about 10%. Truck fleet might convert from oil to gas. So we should not expect a lot of change over there. I have very big doubts about what you call Iraqi production scenario. In your graph, you are suggesting that it is going to increase to 7 million barrels by 2018. And that is, I'm sure you got from somewhere else, but it is really, really doubtful. At some point, when I was working at IEA, of course, Iraqi petroleum minister said they aim to increase Iraqi production by 12 million barrels per day. It's Sistani. And then, of course, this is by 2017 to exit the Saudi Arabia. And of course, there are lots of political and all this problem over there, also infrastructure problem. Last year, IEA reports puts that figure 6.5 million barrel by 2017 or something, but still this year they reduced it again. So I do not expect 2018 or something Iraq to reach 7 million, but of course they are going to increase their production from 3.2 million to, according to best estimates, 5 or 5.5, but not 7 million barrel. Some other observation, I would have liked to see some discussion about what you call higher cost of LTO compared to conventional oil. That's one reason we might see some constraint on the what you call increase in light tight oil production, because unless prices are elevated, we should not see a lot of increase in production. If, let's say, that prices reduce to $80, of course, some oil production is hedged already. For example, in the US, almost 90 to 85% of producers hedge their total production almost over 2 years. In Canada, this figure is about 70% over a year. But still, let's say that prices fell to $80. In Canada, we expect 1 to 1.2 million barrels of oil decline, production decline, if prices fell to $80, because basically break-even price is about 75 and all this stuff, and then of course you have to add the capital expenditure and everything. Second thing, you already discussed, but I would like to see basically you discussed lower exports from OPEC producer to US. Also, this displaced all the oil going to the Asian, which are more robust. And also, we have to make sure to understand some of the dynamics over there. As you know already, one of the reasons why OPEC imports declining to US is the fact that is Venezuelan oil exports. Basically, Venezuela now made some deal with China, and then they can't even supply to China because they got 40 billion credit, and then now they have to pay with crude, but they don't have it, so they have to maybe buy this crude oil to pay that to China. That's why we saw Venezuelan exports to US has declined a lot, but still Venezuela is a very big player in US because they have refineries, Citgo refineries in US Gulf region. If they want, they can always come back because they have the cost advantages compared to Canada or Mexico. And then now we have to think about what's happening in Mexico. Mexico trying to change its constitution, and some experts suggest that we might see 50% increase in Mexican production, which, of course, the close proximity, U.S. is going to be likely what you call export venue. Of course, as what you call Bassam suggested, we should not underplay the importance of OPEC production also. Even with all the new unconventional sources, OPEC remains in control of the low-cost crude, and Saudi Arabia is still the only marginal production with enough spare capacity to influence prices. Basically, as IEA suggested, once this LTO production starts declining or growth declining, OPEC will become again the major player. I mean, it is still major player, but importance will increase again after 2020 or something. But thank you so much for all the deep analysis and very good insights for the impact of tight oil on global energy markets.
Bassam, you have the right to reply if you want.
Just very quickly on a couple of points. The Iraqi production, actually, I'm not at all optimistic, and those were the IEA figures. I was just trying to make the point is that when people are building the perfect storm scenario, Iraq is a very important part of that perfect storm scenario and the lower price environment. And I agree with you that one of the point which I was trying to make here is that the bearish scenario is one of these potential things which could happen, but it's very possible that other scenarios could happen as well, and that's why I brought the issue of into investment. I don't think in the oil market in terms of binary outcomes it's either this or that. It's likely to be a lot of moving parts. So I don't ascribe to any of I don't give a high probability to both of these scenarios. On the break-even cost price, I agree with you, and that's why I argued that perhaps the U.S. tight oil, because it's really different from conventional oil. You know, you can think of it closer to manufacturing, where there's a lot of flexibility, and if it really introduces flexibility into the supply and increases elasticity, then we're likely to enter a phase where the oil price is likely to trade within a range. So if oil prices go up a lot, we're likely to see a lot of production coming on. And if we see prices going down, then perhaps it will put cost on the floor price, production going down. So it's an interesting period. It's a period that we haven't seen anything like this before. But certainly, if I'm doing studies on the elasticity of supply, I would do all of the studies that have been done previously. I think we're likely to see a different estimates of this elasticity of supply as a result of what we are seeing in the US. But we could enter a period of stable prices as well, or at least not if it's not stable prices, prices trading within a narrow range.
Thank you, Bassam. And now, Q&A with the public. Do you have any questions for our speakers? Yes.
hugely dramatic variation. The other thing somehow that countries, you seem to assume that countries that are, let's say, don't have the enabling capacity can't acquire that, either through government policy, future, for instance, the Chinese build enormous amounts of dams. They may think that it's worth investing in enabling infrastructure and channel money, which they have, obviously, into investment because it's a national interest. What do you think, both of you, about those 2 points?
Do you prefer answer immediately or to collect more questions?
As when you feel like.
Oh,
As you prefer.
no, I don't mind.
Let's take more questions.
More questions?
Yes, okay. Another question? There? E poi di qua.
Thank you. Yes, I would also argue we should never underestimate the capacity of Russia or China to do something if they really want to do so, but it will take time for sure. I have a question for Bassam. If I understood you properly toward the end of your last speech, you tended to put a higher probability, thanks to this new elasticity of both supply and demand, to see a certain stabilization in the oil price and a certain range of it. This is what I got from what I understood. Would you agree that this range could be somewhere in between $80 and $120 per barrel, or would you put it somewhere else? Thank you.
I never predict prices, but I will try to answer your question.
I'm always a little bit disappointed in these presentations about the discussion there is on costs. You touch briefly problem of costs, because prices, despite the fact that anybody is quite embarrassed to talk about prices, but prices should be a recovery of costs. Therefore, we in Europe, especially in Italy, and especially close to Enrico Mattei, we have this attitude to ask ourselves what is the right price and the right costs, and therefore it is very interesting to understand what are the costs of these additional supplies to be compared to those of Middle East as well, and in order to what should be the right price in the future. And especially I'm raising the point towards Fattouh about the fact that what could have been the prices without this additional supply. I rather prefer to say, is there any hint of inefficiency in these markets? Despite these huge additional supplies, prices are not going down. Thank you.
I was intrigued by what Mr. Fattouh said at a certain point, that the fact that the oil future remain nearly constant under different scenarios in some way shows that there is some kind of regulation or hidden regulation. Could you go a little bit further on that, just to allow us to understand? And the second question I could have is that you showed that the companies that produce the tight oil are increasing their level of debt, really an incredible amount. And this amount seems to me to be higher than the production expected. So how these are bad news for this company? Can they survive in the long term?
Bassam, would you like to start to answer the questions? Yeah. And then Bahattin?
Yeah.
Okay. There were many questions, so hopefully I don't miss any of these questions. First of all, I wasn't really trying to underestimate the potential of Russia or China or any other country to go into the shale revolution. But what I was trying to draw a comparison of why in the US it has been, what have been the enabling factors, and whether those factors can be easily replicated. So the issue then becomes an issue of cost, of time, And once you start doing all of this replication, you can see that it's likely to be delayed. So it's not, the US experiment was very, very costly. And I doubt even governments who have deep pockets will be able to replicate the same thing which happened to the US. This does not mean that we're not likely to see growth from this country in terms of tight oil production, but it's likely to be slow and it's likely to take a long time. On the issue of prices and costs, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but it's the problem with the oil market. We tend to assume that we have a very smooth supply curve, and we don't have a smooth supply curve. And we tend to assume that we know who is the marginal producer, and we really don't know who's the marginal producer, whether it's going to be very cheap crude oil coming out from Saudi Arabia, or it's going to be more expensive crude oil coming from Canada, because both of these are operating at the margin. On the issue of inefficiency, whether the market, I really don't think the market has been inefficient. On the contrary, I would argue the opposite. We have seen some impact on prices, and this impact we have seen it in the US benchmarks. The US benchmarks have really gone down in terms of prices, and that unfortunately did not benefit the consumers as much, because product prices are determined by global markets. It ended up beefing the refining margin. But that was what I tried to do in my presentation, to warn against seeing everything from the perspective of what's happening in the US. One has to take into account that things have been happening in the US, but there have been other offsetting factors. And if you really want to see the efficiency of the markets, is in the price differentials of how we have seen the biggest shift in trade flows, and how the pricing are sending the right signals of where this crude should be, both within the US and globally. So when you cannot export to the US, for instance, you're a Nigerian exporter, then the market is telling you, that this is the market, Asia, and the prices are reflecting these shifts in trade flows. And if it wasn't that the market was operating properly, I don't think these dramatic shifts in trade flows would have occurred. On the issue of the price range. In the last 3 years, as I mentioned in my presentation, what we have seen is quarterly average prices. Of course, intraday volatility has been quite high, but if you look at the quarterly average prices, they have been really, really stable. And as I mentioned in my presentation, this despite that we have seen so many supply shocks, macroeconomic uncertainties in the US, in the EU. And despite all of this, you saw that prices are being stable. And to my mind, and that's one potential explanation of why we have seen this stability in the price, it has to go to the graph where I showed you Saudi production, where Saudi production was going like this, like this, like this, like this. And if it wasn't for those supply adjustments, perhaps you could have seen much more impact on the prices. Let's say if we have seen Saudi Arabia supply just a straight line throughout this period, you could have seen prices going up and down. Okay, so the quantity adjuster, the way Saudi Arabia adjusts its quantity to the changing demand and supply condition, can explain part of what we have seen in recent years. If you believe that elasticity of supply is likely to become more responsive to price, so if you believe supply is likely to be more responsive to prices on the upside or on the downside, and if you think the US is the marginal producer or can bring oil, if under these assumptions, yes, you could see a stability of the oil price within a certain range. Now, that does not mean that there will be other scenarios where this could break, but then you have to build these scenarios, and that's why in the perfect storm scenario, the OPEC cohesion also matters for that stability. Now, what could this price range be? 80, 100, or 100, 110, or 90, 110? I really cannot speculate I cannot speculate on that. Yeah, I'm still a young person. I don't want to be reminded in a few years' time that I predicted the price because I'm going to get it wrong. I know that. So that's something that I would not do. The final point is on the debt. Yes, what we are seeing in the U.S. is part of the U.S. share revolution is debt. You know, most of the companies have been accumulating debt. If you compare the increase in debt compared to the increase in production, you will see perhaps sometimes the growth of debt has been higher than the growth of production. We have also seen some of the companies suffering negative cash flows. Many, actually, of the companies that operating in the shale is negative cash flows. We've also seen, which unlike other unconventional oil, because in conventional oil fields, you do your capex first, and then you start recovering your capex as you start producing because the marginal cost becomes. There, you need to drill. The only way is basically drill. So capital expenditures are likely to continue to rise capital expenditure. Now, some people call this as a Ponzi scheme. You know, that how far you can go just, you know, on this debt. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that one of the enabling factors have been deep liquid markets, capital markets, low interest rate, and I would say if the interest rates go up, you know, perhaps the model will become a little bit shaky in terms of financing. But if you talk to financiers, they're willing to go over this. Why? I really don't understand. But you know, that's something that one needs to take into account. Exactly. Quick returns. Plus, that's why I mentioned also the idea of hedging as well. That's why the liquid financial markets that we had in the US allow many of these producers to hedge at least 2 years ahead, and 90% of their production is being hedged. So they can take a little bit of a shock on their cash flows. But it's a completely different model. It's a model that needs a lot of debt, and that's why even for Russian governments or for to put so much capital behind a little bit of gas which comes out towards the end, they really need to think about it carefully. Unless, of course, there's energy security concerns and all of that which come into play. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, you want to follow up? Go ahead.
No, the amount of investments that they did in the United States, how many billions of dollars?
I do not have the exact numbers, but hundreds of billions we're talking. So it's not small amounts. Yeah.
Okay. First, let me go to demand side of the story, basically. I actually put some slides on the demand side, but since the conference is about tight oil revolution, I did not spend a lot of time, but you're completely right. Basically, if you look at the IEA or EIA projection, the most dramatic change is actually from the demand side rather than the supply side. If you look at, for example, in 2007 projection, in 2007, IEA was projecting that U.S. consumption of liquid fuel consumption was supposed to be 23.8 million barrels per day. But they reduced it to 19.5 million barrels per day in 2013 projection. If you look at Europe, again, in 2007, they were projecting Europe to consume 15.6 million barrels per day by 2020. Now, their latest projection is about 13.8 million barrels. Of course, when we are talking about the North American energy independence or something, actually it is coming from the consumption side rather than the production side, actually. You are completely right on that one. Regarding the light oil possibilities in other countries, basically, I do not expect short-term, what you call, reversal basically because of human capital and all this, not only the human capital, also capex, also institutional frameworks, basically property rights and how you are going to change from Russia, for example. It is not exactly clear to me how soon they can change. I mean, yes, government organized, but in order to profit, you have to have some kind of let's call property rights, very well defined property rights. Yes, it might be possible in the medium term, but I don't see in the short term. For the cost curves, let me basically, if we look at, for example, Canadian side, supply cost curve for oil sands project have more than tripled relative to levels seen in 2005. For example, when I look at these are marginal supply costs for oil sands in situ in 2005 per barrel it was about 22.61. In 2012 it is $50. And mining and extraction, for example, 21.48, it's now $68. And integrated mining and upgrading, $42 in 2005, it's now $100. Basically, supply costs has been increasing. As a result of that one, capex has increased. Capex increased, basically, I told you in 2005 or something, it was $3.50 billion. In 2012, they spent about $710 billion. $710 billion. Brent prices, for example, increased from $38 to $112 during this period, same period, and which is about 180% increase, I believe, right? It's about, right, 195% increase. This is just slightly above the increase in capital expenditures. That actually make these capital expenditures worthwhile. Otherwise, if the prices not elevated, I don't think any what you call company can survive with these capital expenditures. Because yes, you do the capital expenditure, as Bassam suggested, they hedge their production for at least 2 years in the US, 1 year in 12 months to 15 months in Canada. With that one, yes, you can still produce, even if prices went down below break-even prices. But thanks to hedging opportunities and elevated prices, still there are, increasing production possibilities. But otherwise, I don't see any reason how these companies can survive unless prices remain elevated.
Just very quickly on the demand side, sorry, I forgot as well, but Bahattin dealt with it. We're really not expecting a lot of demand growth. A good year would be if demand growth reaches 1 million barrels per day or 1.2 million barrels per day. That's year-on-year growth. So that as a result of efficiency measures, as a result of price effects. So we're seeing a lot of the impact of prices on demand. So not for a second that we have forgotten demand because of the nature of the presentation. The other thing which I would like also to mention is for a long period of time we got used to think non-OECD demand is China, and now this is changing. Actually, in the last couple of years, the contribution of China to non-OECD demand growth has been reducing, and one also needs to look at other countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, where we have less transparency of the data. So perhaps some of the demand is likely to come from these, and we're likely to realize it later on. because the demand growth figures are likely to be a little bit, I would say, quite low given the growth of the global economy. So perhaps once we have a better picture of what's happening in these countries, plus the fact one has to take into account that the Middle East as well has become an important consumption center, Russia, Latin America, Africa. So global demand growth, it's fine, it's healthy, 1.2, the market can deal with this. I would say that we would worry if the demand figures were bigger than those. Then the issue is how to supply how to meet such rapid demand growth.
Any more questions?
I'm asking a question which is probably not related to this talk, but we have a sizable amount of oil shales in Sicily, and I wonder if they will ever be tried to be used. Italy is a difficult country. The Italian regions are even more difficult, and so it's not clear if there is a movement in this direction. I don't know to whom the question is.
I am an environmental economist now. I'm sorry if you...
I will leave it to you, please.
No. I'm sorry, I have no answer about this. Any more questions? Okay. I would like to thank again my speakers, Bassam and Bahattin, for their excellent presentation, for coming to Milano, for helping me address this really interesting topic. I hope to see you. I would like to thank you for attending this workshop, these lectures, and I hope to see you again next year at the second meeting on this topic. I hope to have here a guru, the third guru after Bassam and Bahattin, John Deutsch from MIT, who is a great expert of the oil markets and the US strategies. And thank you again, and we have a lunch outside here if you want, and see you again. Bye.